Bueno, buenas tardes, buenos días, bienvenidas, bienvenidos. Vamos a iniciar con contándoles o compartiéndoles que están abiertas las inscripciones para nuestro programa de maestría en filosofía y para nuestro programa de doctorado en filosofía hasta finales del mes de octubre. So welcome everyone. We are opening, telling you that and inviting you to join us to study postgraduate programs in our Institute of Philosophy. We have open inscriptions for master's program and PhD programs during the October, so you can check our website and find all the information there. So thanks very much. Well, welcome everyone to this panel on the history of science. Since the formation of our research group on knowledge, philosophy, science, history, and society in 2006 at the University of Antioquia, history of science has played a central role in our intellectual itinerary, relying on traditions established by our former colleagues in the 1970s and 1980s. Back then, the archetypal topics of the scientific revolution and the emergence of new science in Europe provided a connection with epistemological questions via the French tradition of Canguilhem, Bachelard, and Coiré. At the same time, the philosophical readings of Popper, Kuhn, and Lakatos made visible the importance of history for a satisfactory explanation of the emergence and development of science. A third, very suggestive line coming from studies on Greek philosophy evolved in sustained work on the history of medicine that in the last decade is encompassing epidemiology, public health, and the history of surgery. These enable a first connection with the life sciences that has been renovated by colleagues working on the philosophy of mind and cognition. From the 2000s onwards, the interest in the history of science began to explore connections with science and technology studies. Science is a historical activity, sure, but it is also done by human beings in specific geographic political settings with limited resources, motivated and limited by changing interests. From this perspective, the studies on the Neo-Grenadian Enlightenment and the medical and mathematical works of Celestino Mutis opened the door to a wider range of problems, exploring the connections between science, knowledge, nature, and society in the Spanish-American world, with specific focus on New Granada. These works have been uncovering conceptions of nature emerging in colonial context, in which the struggles for dominance over others, but also over nature, were the rule of the day. In this context, this panel provides an occasion to think about three major categories and their connections from specific case studies. Nature is no longer the scenario on which human action takes place, or the abstract substratum of scientific theories, but a fundamental complex force that makes possible but also limits and sometimes even renders impossible the development of human societies. In this environment, environment, as it has been brought to our attention by environmental historians, open a space of possibilities to address new questions and shed new light on all problems. Although the history of science, and particularly the history of medicine, has provided occasions to analyze the effects of environment itself and its effects on humans, environmental history has highlighted the importance of considering as well the changes caused by human agency in the natural environment and their impact on human society. These changes are driven to some extent by religious, philosophical, political, or even scientific conceptions of nature. But as history of science has highlighted, conceptions of nature are embedded within networks of interest and relations of power. Thus, empire here today stands for these relations of power necessary to explain the emergence, circulation, and transformations of objects, but also of conceptions of nature that, to a large extent, provide the basis for human collective action over the natural world. The case studies we discussed today problematize ideas of nature and environment or uncover assumptions involving human or societal actions. At the same time, these studies reflect on the dynamics of colonial power involving the adoption of ideas to make sense of the immediate surroundings. I have the pleasure to be in a very good company with Lawrence Rita, Senior Lecturer, Science, Technology, and Innovation Studies at the University of Edinburgh, and Dr. Sebastián Molina, who is research fellow at the University of Bergamo. Our panel will start with the 3 presentations, and after them, we will have some time to answer questions and to talk. You can write questions in the question and answers box if you are following in Zoom, or you can type them as commentaries on Facebook if you're following the transmissions on Facebook Live. So without any further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Sebastián Molina. Sebastián studied philosophy at the University of Antioquia, where he also completed his master's in philosophy. He was a lecturer at the Instituto de Filosofía, the Department of Industrial Engineering, and the School of Economics of the University of Antioquia. He completed his PhD at the University of Turin with an awarded dissertation on José Celestino Mutis and the dissemination of Newtonianism in New Granada. Since 2018, he's a research fellow at the Department of Philosophy, Letters and Communications of the University of Bergamo in Italy, where he advances 2 research projects dealing with the dissemination of early modern science in colonial Latin America. He is currently writing the book José Celestino Mutis and the Newtonianism in New Granada, which will be published by Palgrave in 2022. So Sebastián, thanks for accepting the invitation. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Sergio, for your kind introduction. Today I was remembering the first time I participated in this seminar of the Instituto de Filosofía, and back in 2006, and it made me remember how old we are getting, how experienced we are getting, I mean. So today I'm going to talk about Caldece as a meteorologist. This is an ongoing research that I am doing to my book, and today I'm going to present some preliminary results. So I am looking forward to hear your comments and questions about it. The contents of this presentation will be divided into 4 sections. In the first one, I make a brief introduction of early 19th century meteorology, and then I move forward to explain Caldece's works in meteorology, focusing on his hypsometric works, and then on the meteorological projects he developed in the context of the Semanario, which was the journal he edited and published since 1808. So first, I present a brief characterization of early 19th century meteorology. As you should know, meteorology was not and is not only a discipline or a science focused on the description and prediction of weather. As of its very inception in ancient Greece, it included the study of several phenomena happening in the atmosphere. These phenomena include evaporation, thunders, winds, the potential effects of these on the life. And here we have, for instance, the image of the first ever written treatise on meteorology, which was Aristotle's Meteorological. This work turned into the authority on weather since its rediscovery in the 13th century until around mid-17th century. Then later I'm going to explain why did this situation change in this period. In the Meteorological, Aristotle develops a deductive-based method, arguing that meteorological phenomena should be subsumed to physics and consequently should be explained in terms of the interaction of sublunar elements, earth, air, water, and fire. But basically, the interactions were between earth, water, and air. By their interactions, Aristotle said they produce the basic opposite qualities of bodies, heat and cold, dry and dryness and moisture, and the interaction of these qualities and the elements produced meteorological phenomena in general. For instance, Aristotle explained thunders as the result of the ejection of dry exhalations of clouds when the clouds were in the process of condensation. Ejected dry exhalations could catch fire in the presence in the atmosphere, in the air or the sublunar region, would say Aristotle, and then produce lightnings. These were classical examples of the kinds of explanations we found in Meteorological. What is interesting to highlight in this point is that this deductive approach based many of the meteorological descriptions framed in the colonization of the New World. Here, for instance, we have Cieza de Leon's description of the Gorgona Island in the image in the right top of the slide. And in this characterization, Cieza de Leon presents that, or claims that in the Gorgona Island in Colombia's nowadays territories, never stops raining and thundering. It looks like the elements were fighting to each other all the time. In general, this kind of approach, the Aristotelian approach, I mean, underlies in all the information related project of the Spanish Empire in its colonization of the New World, as it is possible to see in the replies to the questionarios developed in the second half of the 16th century, which were supposed to be the base for the information network supporting the Spanish rule of the New World. In the 17th century, there was a dramatic change for meteorology. It began for two key factors. In the first place, there was the development of a corpuscular account of meteorological phenomena by Descartes, which made possible to put meteorology in the frame of mechanics. And secondly, the creation of meteorological instruments such as the barometer, the thermometer, and the hygrometer made possible the development of more precise meteorological observations. These instruments created the framework in which qualitative descriptions or Aristotelian qualitative descriptions were replaced by quantitative descriptions in which measurements played a decisive role for the development of meteorology as a field. This revolution is well represented by two historical events, which I put here in the slide. The first one is Pascal's barometric experiments at the Puy du Dôme, where he demonstrated the weight of the air and how atmospheric pressure varied in function of the altitude. In the second place, there is the letter from Sagredo to Galileo in 1630, which contains the first reference to a record of thermometric measurements. In general, the experimental approach to meteorology developed during the 17th century and the first half of the 18th century made possible the creation of systematic projects of observation which were mostly focused on the quantitative description of meteorological phenomena, rather than on the theoretical account of them. This theoretical account, let us say so, began at the second half of the 18th century, when the experimental approach was transformed thanks to the work of several meteorologists, but in particular, there were two works that were highly influential. These were degli, Recherche sur la modification de l'atmosphère, et Saussures, Voyage dans les Alpes. In these works, degli and Saussure managed to create a rather exact experimental style in which large series of observations were subsumed to mathematical explanation of meteorological phenomena. This explanation made possible more dynamic accounts in which there were included multiple variables such as humidity, temperature, altitude, gravity, and chemical reactions. What is particular of this period is that despite all the attempts to mathematize it, meteorology resisted the mathematical generalizations, and it was rather developed upon large sets of observations. In this framework, in the early 19th century, we find Caldece's work on meteorology. So now I'm going to show that Caldece's meteorological works were framed precisely in the context of this renovated exact experimental approach to meteorology by considering some pieces of evidences that I have found in Caldece's letters, as well as in his works, unpublished works. As you probably know, although Caldece was a student of José Félix de Restrepo, he was an autodidact in physics and mathematics. He was a lawyer with no scientific background or training. So when he discovered his interest in studying nature around 1795, he was forced to train himself to use the scientific instruments to make different kinds of observations. So when Caldece moved from Bogotá to Popayán in 1796, he seized the opportunity to put in practice what he had learned about them by making different kinds of observations in small villages and towns. As these letters, these ones here in the slide, to his friend Santiago Royo demonstrate, Caldece managed to create a systematic program of meteorological observations that include both barometric and thermometric observations. It is interesting to highlight that Caldece mentioned to his friend the pretension of creating a major cartographic project in which these observations will play a fundamental role in order to create a map of all the territory of New Granada. Although Caldece mentioned this cartographic project, however, here and there in different letters to Arroyo between 1796 and 1800, his scientific interests during this period seemed to move toward astronomy and botany, probably as he saw in his application to this field the possibility of getting a position in the botanical expedition to New Granada that Mutis directed as of 1783. However, everything changed for Caldece in 1801. So he began to be interested in meteorology around 1795. He wrote to his friend Arroyo arguing or commenting that he was making barometrical and thermometric observations. Then he partially abandoned these observations for his interest in astronomy and botany. And then in 1801, everything changed and Caldece went back to meteorology. This is likely, 1801 is likely Caldece's annus mirabilis, as he not only managed to create a new method of measuring the altitude of mountains by means of the thermometer, but he also settled the foundations for the development of his phytogeography, or how he calls it, the geography of the plants. As Caldece's thermometric method is well known, I would like to focus here in its periodization rather than on the description of the method itself. In April, Caldece wrote to Arroyo that he had read a paper in the Correo Curioso, a journal published in Bogotá, in which there was a measurement of Guadalupe Peak that he claimed was mistaken. In this letter, Caldece claims that he wants to publish a paper with the corrected altitude of the peak using the barometric observation he made while he was in Bogotá in 1796. Remember that he lived in Bogotá between 1795 and in 1795 in a short period, and then he bought some meteorological instruments such as the barometer and the thermometer, and he began to make some observations. For this purpose, for the purpose of publishing this paper correcting the measure of the Guadalupe Peak, Caldece asked his friend to send him Bouquer's table describing how to convert barometric measurements into altitudes. This is an indicative that despite Caldece was making barometric observations as of 1796, he did not know how to use them for hypsometric purposes. I mean, he was making the observations, but he didn't know how to use them. Between April and May, his should send to Caldece Bouguer's book, because in May, Caldece published the Observaciones sobre la verdadera altura del Cerro de Guadalupe, which has been recorded as the first scientific publication ever written in New Granada. In it, using Bouguer's and Jorge Juan's hypsometric methods, Caldece managed to convert his barometric measurements of Guadalupe Peak into measurements of altitude. This was the first time that the quantitative approach to meteorology developed in the 18th century was applied in Caldece's works. However, the most important results of Caldece's 1801 hypsometric researches were still to come. In a letter of April, Arroyo told to Caldece that he had broken his thermometer. In his reply, Caldece suggested, which is the reply is the first square that you can see in the slide, the first image. In a letter, Arroyo told Caldece that he had broken his thermometer, and in his reply, Caldece suggested to use Juan's method to fix it, which was focused on the determination of the maxima and the minima of the thermometer. For this purpose, Caldece suggested to his friend that as there was no snow in Bogota, he should use hail to determine the minima. For the maxima, however, Caldece claims that he needs to revise the books. This is a very important fact in order to characterize the periodization of the discovery of the method, or the invention of the method. Caldece claims that he needs to revise the books because the method for determining the maxima, which was putting the thermometer into boiling water, was not completely accurate. The reasons for this was that in fixing his own thermometer, which was broken in an expedition to the Puracé volcano, Caldece had found multiple problems for determining the maxima of his thermometer. As Caldece described it, when he was trying to set the scale in his fixed thermometer by comparing it with another one, the degrees resulted smaller than the ones of the thermometer of reference. By considering the difference of altitude between Popayán, he was trying to fix the thermometer, and the sea level, well, thermometers were usually sealed, Caldece concluded that the variation of pressure the smaller degrees in his fixed thermometer. Thus, Caldece explained that because the temperature of the boiling point of water is affected by the air pressure, it boils at different temperatures at different altitudes. Thus, it was possible to measure the altitude of a place by measuring the boiling point of water in it. That was the method, the thermometric method Caldece invented here in Popayán in May 1801. In June the 5th, as we can see, Caldece wrote to his friend again, telling him further details of his thermometric method. Caldece's enthusiasm was evident as he claimed that his method was even more precise than the barometric method. He also invited his friend to make thermometric observations in Bogota in order to compare the results to evaluate the certainty of the method. What is interesting here is that Caldece formulates a program of experimental research that included observations in different places and altitudes. As we can see in this letter from July 5, 1801, Caldece told his friend that he would like to seize a personal travel to Quito to put his program in practice. However, this program, let us say so, was only developed partially because when Caldece moved to Quito, he had no, at first at least, he had no opportunity to make these observations. The first observations Caldece made in this program were, in fact, in nearby villages, the results of which seemed to confirm that his method could be used for measuring altitudes. However, being at Quito, he was more cautious regarding his method. His caution was partially caused by the presence of Humboldt, to whom Caldece intended to present his method in order to verify if it worked in the first place and if it was an original invention in the second place. As a result of Caldece's discussion with Humboldt, and moved by the interest of being appointed to the botanical expedition, Caldece wrote a letter to Mutis in which he included his ensayo de una memoria sobre un nuevo método para medir las alturas de las montañas por el termómetro. In the ensayo, Caldece presented the rationale of his method, the experimental results he obtained, and the ratio of variation of the boiling point of water with the altitude. The ratio is this one in the top right of the image of the slide. In the years between 1802 and 1804, however, Caldece's enthusiasm toward his method was reduced in part because of his own observations, which led him to doubt about the accuracy of his method, and in part because, being appointed to the botanical expedition, he was forced to work on botanical observations and description of natural history, especially in the case of the study of the quina bark. So Caldece stopped, let us say, suddenly, in a sudden way, of working about hypsometry in spite of his discovery, because of his obligations to the botanical expedition. Despite that Caldece never fully stopped to make meteorological observations during these years, we can say that his meteorological observations only resumed once he was appointed director of the Astronomical Observatory in 1805. From this year on, he dedicated himself to make a large set of meteorological observations that helped him to determine the position and altitude of the observatory, which he managed to publish in the Semanario del Nuevo Reino de Granada, a journal that he edited and published between 1808 and 1811. In addition to publish his meteorological observation in the journal, Caldece invited to the subscribers to become into meteorological observers themselves, sending to him the data about weather in general, including barometric and thermometric measurements, as well as rates of precipitation, wind direction, and intensity. Interestingly, Caldece had a twofold purpose in creating this network. On one hand, he intended to have enough information to fulfill his cartographic project, the cartographic project he had presented to his friend Arroyo in 1795. And on the other hand, and this is particularly more interesting for my research purposes, Caldece, had a theoretical pretension. These are the invitations to the subscribers to send him the meteorological observations. And here we have the other part that for me is more interesting, and is the fact that Caldece proposes to determine the laws regulating the meteorological phenomena. As we can see in this paper from the Semanario, which is a section of his prologue to the Almanac of 1811, Caldece argued that just like God had created laws to regulate the motion of bodies, he must have created laws for regulating meteorological phenomena, which only could be known by means of a large set of observations. This is particularly interesting because we'll have presented a Caldece who is usually concerned by practical issues. However, here we can see that he also was concerned by theoretical elements of the meteorological investigation, theoretical elements that were theologically founded. This is a path to research that I am focused on in my in my book, in the book I am writing in this moment. I would like to conclude by briefly characterizing the aftermath of Caldece's meteorological investigations. Let's say that in general, his meteorological activities resulted in publications with a scant impact even in New Granada. His ensayo was only published posthumously in 1819 in France, thanks to the initiative of one of his friends. In this publication, it was also included an image of the thermometer that Caldece had invented to measure the altitude of mountains. On the other hand, Caldece's considerations about weather generated a small debate with his friend Martin Tanco regarding the role of weather on life. In a paper entitled El influjo del clima sobre los seres organizados, published in the Semanario, Caldece argued that weather determined the behavior of every form of life, from plants to human beings. Finally, it is also important to highlight that Caldece's meteorological works were shadowed by the revolutionary processes leading to the independence in which he was forced to participate. However, as we can see in this letter, the letter from the bottom of this slide, to Pascal Enrile, in which Caldece asked for help to avoid his condemnation, he kept his meteorological works as a fundamental part of his endeavors, one so important that should be considered to save his own life. Thank you.
Sebastián, thanks very much for your presentation. We're going to talk a bit more about meteorology and travels and peaks later on. So for those who are just joining us now, we have three presentations. The first one about Caldece that Sebastián just finished. And then we're going to move to the next presentation, and we're going to close with Lawrence Rita's in the end. So I'm going to move back in time, and I think, let me try again. This is it. Okay, so, well, thanks very much again for attending. And I'm going to talk about a period which is a bit behind in time, a bit before in time, Sebastian's, but it's also connected to meteorological questions. And my topic is called Stars, Creatures, and Identities, the popularization of astrology through Spanish-American repertorios de los tiempos. And I'm going to give you a context to make some sense of what I'm talking about. I'm trying to understand how knowledge came as part of the so-called Columbian exchange. So after 1943, we know that it's famous, that expression came from environmental history, that there was a big exchange, so to speak, of all kinds of species, all kinds of plants, trade, but also ideas. And I'm trying to understand how this exchange of ideas operated, especially during the 15th, 16th century, particularly during the 16th century in colonial Latin America. So I'm going to highlight three special points. There's in this study of the exchange of ideas, or how ideas of early modern Renaissance and early modern Europe arrived in Colombia. There's a strong emphasis on institutional views. They call institutional views, there is a top-down approach. So how knowledge was produced in centers of powers, be the centers of powers Madrid, but also Mexico or Peru, or teaching institutions like universities and colleges. So there is an idea that knowledge is produced in these centers and is spread from these centers through peripheries in the continent or in the peripheries of colonial territories. This is one idea I'm going to try to challenge with this presentation. The second one is the priority of a printed over manuscript. So if we focus a lot on printed books, we forget that, and we leave out that, for example, in New Granada, the printing press arrived in 1738. So we will have to agree that we can now properly speak about knowledge in the past. And this is a view of history that, for example, can be seen in ideas that only printed ideas are mature enough or good enough to circulate. But this is a problem, because we will have to ignore 2 centuries of development of knowledge. And also then, I'm interested in other forms of circulation of knowledge different from institutions, institutional centers, and books sanctioned by authorities or promoted by universities and colleges. So I'm interested in local approaches of ideas, of exchange of ideas. And for that, I'm tracking a genre of writing that now it's called the Repertorios de los Tiempos. Is a genre of writing that evolved from earlier almanacs or lunarios tables from the moon. And it was a rather short piece of paper initially, stating the position of the moon, the dates of eclipses, and some astronomical information that was relevant to understand or to practice agriculture, to do some forecast and meteorology, but also thanks to the connection between astrology and medicine that goes back to ancient times and is very important and influential during the Renaissance and the early modern period. These almanacs also provided information that was valuable for the practice of medicine. We'll talk about that in a second. So these almanacs that circulated in manuscripts in ancient times and particularly in medieval times had an important growing with the invention of press, because they were a small piece of paper that circulated a lot, that were very popular, very demanded, and there's a massive explosion of production of almanacs all over Europe, but different, especially the South, particularly Italy, Spain, and Portugal, were very, very influential in producing little almanacs that were important for navigation and agriculture and trade purposes. So I'm going to differentiate, sorry about that. I'm going to differentiate about 2 different moments in the production of almanacs in Spain. And there is an early tradition that is rooted in this medieval tradition of almanac that is connected to the Jewish calendar, that is connected to Islamic forecast and astrology. And this kind of almanac is typical of the almanacs that circulated all over Europe, these earlier repertorios, as they are called, and they circulated in Spain massively, but also varieties or similar of these circulated in the Netherlands, France, and Spain. What do you find in this kind of little almanacs? And obviously with the printing revolution that we call, these almanacs became products of luxury, so to speak. So printers try to improve them, to add stuff. So this is a typical almanac that evolved in Spain, and I'm going to present a typical one. So what do we have in this Repertorio de los Tiempos? First, we have very short definitions of what is time, what is the day, what is a year, what is a month, how long they last. So they're like a short summary of information with sometimes mythological references, but it's rather concrete and specific, and it serves to kind of like make sense of the calendars and information that is contained, but it doesn't have like a very high theoretical pretensions, aspirations. So we find these little definitions, and after that, we find astrological characterizations of every month. What is January? What are the main, influences and aspects in January? And then we have the planets or the stars, and what are the astrological characteristics of the stars. So I'm going to put the example of Mercury that we have on the right of the presentation that is beautifully illustrated with Mercury the god. And this repertory says that Mercury which is the same as reasoning, and that's why reasoning is the way by which we are persuaded to buy and trade. For this reason, the ancients called Mercury the god of trade. It's a masculine planet, and it influences all kinds of intelligence, such as men of letters, painters, and those who deal with subtle topics. In beasts, deers and goats, and those of light run, it makes them slow. It rules some birds and the bees, and also the worms that are under the soil. It affects some trees, particularly cider, lemon trees, ginger, pomegranate. Those born under Mercury without the influence of any other planet, shall have a small body, little but handsome eyes, and shall be witty. So this is the kind of information we find here in the concerning the planet. For example, keep this in mind because we're going to see some contrast with this. So apart from the months and the planets, we have characterization of the signs, which are the main constellations against the path of the sun, against the background of the zodiac. So we think that the center is the Earth is at the center, and the sun turns around the Earth. The path projected against the sphere of a star follows a path, and the stars illuminated by the sun create some constellations, or humans created constellations, and they are supposed to have influences on the life on Earth. So also these repertorios contain this characterization of signs. We also have here that is very typical, the calendar for the year, or a system of calendars with letters that is supposed to last or be useful for 10 years, 40 years, 50 years. And we have a religious calendar saying, which is the day of, Easter or the Holy Week, but also agricultural, medical observation. Look at this example. For example, this is concern January, which is the left page, the page on the left, and it says, in this month, it is convenient to transplant grapevines and roses and jasmine. And also explain, in this month, you must take baths. In this month, you eat and drink clear potages. And it is very important not to leave the table if you are still thirsty. So another important component, as I mentioned, of astrology was the connection with the medical practice. As we can see, for example, here, the beautiful and classic zodiac man that goes back to different medieval, but also West medieval, but also Islamic traditions, in which there is a correlation between different parts of the body and different signs. And the calendars provided information for a certain period of which parts of the body should be treated and how in specific periods or months, depending on the conjunction of planets with their properties and the ruling signs or constellations for the period. So in this sense, calendar provide quite specific and concrete information for understanding the human body, agricultural practices, and meteorological phenomenon. For example, they also contain the so-called lunarios, or tables of the moon, with the moon phases and the ruling sign for each phase, and calculations or specific phases of the moon and their influences on all these practices. So we can see these little books or these short prints as very, very practical oriented. But in the Spanish tradition and Iberian tradition, because there are some Portuguese developments, particularly in 1548, I identify a big turn that in my view has not been previously noted, and the impact is quite huge in my understanding of the topic. And in 1548, Jerónimo de Chávez, who was an important mathematician and cosmographer, son of a major pilot, Alonso de Chávez, and very influential in his translation of Sacro Bosco's Syria, in his translation of some mathematical treatises. And then he produced a repertorio, but he added very, very significant elements. First, he introduced cosmographical elements of geography, of choreography, but also elements of astronomy and mathematical elements that we didn't see in the previous repertorios that I just described. So this edition included astronomical elements from Sacroboscian sphere that were typical university topics, the theory of elements coming from Aristotle, and some reworks of Aristotle and medieval Islamic Aristotle, and also chronologies, important chronologies, very well calculated, so to speak, from the position of stars, from the description of astronomical phenomena in historical books. So this tradition has completely been overlooked, and there has been some work on this tradition in Protestant countries, but not in Catholic countries. So I think this is very significant that there's a tradition of chronology, of astronomical chronology, historical chronology here. So these three elements, in my view, provided an articulated worldview, a view of a space as mathematically organized in geography, but also the space of the cosmos in astronomy, astronomical timely, mathematically organized view of time, as well as provided by this historical chronology and a sense of history. So in my view, these repertorios that started with Chavez, this big turn in 1548, these little almanacs became kind of like little compendiums of the world, little world views, more than just practical books. So we find some elements that we don't find in the previous repertorios. I'm going to present some slides to show you what is this about. We find, for example, this beautiful cross-section that comes from medieval textbook. On the left, we have a medieval textbook, Sacro Bosco, that made their way to Chavez to present an overview of the elements at the very center: fire, water, and air. And then we have the surrounding spheres up to the sphere of the stars. So this representation and a further description that in the little almanacs were only what is a day, what is a month, here we find a more developed Aristotelian, Ptolemaic, and early modern in some aspects, ideas about the stars, about the planets, and about the comets, for example. We find chronologies. There's an inclusion of emperor, kings of Egypt, Persia, Rome emperor. There's a catalog of popes and of the king of Spain. So there's a sense of history. There's a sense of the development of humanity from the creation of the world according to the Genesis up to the Last Judgment. And we can see, for example, how these mathematical elements transform these little treatises in more ambitious treatises and in more ambitious pieces of writing. Even the graphic and the illustrative tradition was severely modified. Think, for example, in Zamorano's chronology, which is after Jerónimo de Chávez, this is 1594, but the first edition is 1585. We see how the classic Theorica Planetarium, that are very technical and sophisticated mathematical devices to explain the motion, the irregular motion of planets, made the way to the illustration, for example, in the case of Mercury. So if you compare these with the one I presented earlier, you can see a detailed mathematical, it's almost a quasi-physical explanation of the motion of every planet that was absent from the previous one. So these big transformation in repertorios are books with practical intention that now including this worldview, this significant element, including a mathematical sense of space-time and a sense of history, were massively read in the New World. So if we pay attention to the circulation of these books that are just little prints rather than books read in universities and institutions that were traded and sometimes smuggled because some of them got part of their commentaries were censored by the Inquisition. So we find a very, very different perspective. So in the history of repertories in the New World, most historians have focused on Enrico Martinez, which is a German writing in Mexico, and he writes a repertorio kind of like this style to include some Mexican aspects. So I find that very interesting and very important, but I want to focus on manuscripts, and I want to focus on the reception that Native Americans, indigenous, and mestizos made of this. So I'm going to present three different little examples to make my point and to show that, on the one hand, these repertorios were adapted to agricultural, meteorological practices and expectations in the New World, not only by the conquerors and invaders and landowners coming from Europe, but also by locals. But also, on the other hand, because these new repertorios that I characterized a second ago provided a more complex worldview, these mestizos and indigenous try to include their local history within this worldview and develop a local sense of history, trying to mix, for example, local indigenous ways to account history into the universal history of salvation, of redemption. So I'm going to present, highlight three different little cases. So the first one is a repertorio Nahuatl that was written in the 16th century. You have the transliteration there, and it's very interesting because it's a short piece of paper, but it mentions local and also imported animals and plants. So there's a combination of an attempt to understand how to operate with different kind of plants and animals in a different context. This little repertorio is a repertorio because it explicitly says at the beginning that it's a repertorio. And it's a short, rather short almanac, which includes an adaptation of this repertorio genre to indigenous interest. So it says, beginning of the repertorio de los tiempos, many things are not included here, for they are not of interest of the indigenous. It starts with January, and here we find Aquarius. So I'm gonna remember the example I read earlier. In this month, here in the Nahuatl, it says, in this month, it is convenient to take hot baths in temazcals, which is these hot baths that we see on the right side in this codex. And the food and the meals should be hot. Warm food is convenient. Those born in this month shall not be tall. Some of them shall be very short, and they will be very fond of women, says the Nahuatl. So there's an adaptation here of medical practice, but also to local technology. So I want to highlight that. If we move, for example, to the Codex Mexicanus that was produced around 60 years after the invasion of Tenochtitlan of Mexico City, some intellectuals gathered together and they wrote fantastic codex, which is a repertorio. For a long time, many people thought it was just a curious, illustrative Aztec history. But if you check, for example, the image we have in the screen in detail, you see a system of letters and you see signs on top. For example, you see a Pope, which is St. Peter's Day, or you see some, for example, here, not sure if you see my cursor, but you see some legs going up to heaven, which is the ascension of the Lord. And down under it, you see a system of letters that is a system of letters corresponding in Aztec pictorial system to an adaptation of a calendric system of Catholic inspiration. So the starting point is a sentence that says that the Friar of St. Augustine arrived at San Pablo in 1575. That is, St. Paul is at the very center of the system. And this will allow the calculation of the Dominical letters and years. But more significant than this adaptation of the calendar is the adaptation of Christianity. For example, in this image, we see some indigenous represented in what seems to be an illustration of the image of the road to Emmaus, in which two men encounter a stranger up to the road and ended up being Christ. So we see two different biblical images here, but what is important is that the clothing indicates that these are indigenous people find in Jesus. So this may be, you may argue that this may come from just classical evangelization activities, but I want to show that the structure, for example, that is taken from Laurie Deal, the study of the Codex Mexicanus, shows a very similar distribution of Repertorio de los Tiempos. There's a monthly calendar, there's a calendar wheel, medical charts, and there's a sacred, in this case, Aztec calendars. But then we find the genealogy of, you know, the royal dynasty and the annals of history, and that overlaps at the end with the biblical visions and a history of Christianity. So there's an attempt to include Aztec history within this universal history of Christianity that is mobilized in repertorios. We have, for example, another case, the last case I want to mention, that is the case I'm more interested now, is the case of a manuscript called Tratado de Astronomía y la Reformación del Tiempo, a treatise on astronomy and the reformation of time, that was written in 1695, between 1676 and 1696 in Vélez, in New Granada. And it follows the structure of repertorios, but it provides very, very different aspects. There's a transformation, a very significant transformation of cosmography and astrology. So rather than copying the same information of repertorios, Sanchez transformed, for example, here, the idea of the Theorica Planetarum that goes back here in the case of Feuerbach, for example. I'm presenting the illustration of the left side, and he transformed this layered orb into an orb with a pyramidal knot to explain the motion and the irregularities of the motion of planets. So it's not a passive reception of an astrological, astronomical theory, but a creative transformation that we see here. If you think about the cross-section that I presented some slides in the past that came from Sacro Bosco, and we depict Sanchez cross-section that is lost, unfortunately, in the manuscript, it will look like this. So in this case, there is not just a copy of a cross-section that came from medieval time through Renaissance, early modern treatises, but there is a cross-section and illustration of how the world should look according to his theory of the heaven. But more interestingly is that, as this doesn't happen, for example, in the Iberian tradition, but can be found here, is that the history of the world in biblical terms is illustrated with this machina mundi, and he depicts how the world should look after the last judgment. So there's a sense of history in which is extended even to mathematical and natural philosophical aspects in the terms of the Repertorio de los Tiempos. I want to point out also this sense of Christianization, this temporal Christianization of the Machina Mundi has a local dimension in Sanchez. So as in the Codex Mexicanos, we saw the inclusion of Aztec history as a part of creation of a local identity against this universal identity. In the case of Sanchez, he's interested in showing that he is descendant from indigenous, he is descendant from Spaniards, and that this, let's say that this tradition, this background sets him in a very specific moment of time, which is this. He writes, when writing to the king in the very start of his treatise, he says to the king, now, like now in the present, we appreciate more being your vassals than what we were dominating others, because that freedom and dominance lack the light of the gospel, while this servitude and vassalage is with such a light. Through the invincible weapons of our Catholic monarchs, your predecessors in glorious memory, we were told by the mercy of the supreme and true God, that after so many thousand years, all these nations, the nations of the New World, so numerous and extended, remain the sad darkness of God's gentility. But now we enjoy this benefit, and we have more insofar the spiritual is better than the material. So this is just a little piece of a larger introduction in which he positions the New World as part of the history of Christianity leading to the Last Judgment. So in this sense, this Repertorio de los Tiempos and his reading he makes of this popular genre allows him, as in a similar way to the other codexes we check, position himself in the history of the world, a world understood in Christian terms leading to the Last Judgment. So just to conclude, I want to point that the popularization of knowledge was more than an adoption of foreign frameworks to interpret local circumstances, that something that we may think, for example, from the now world, if we don't read in detail, but the popularization of astrology through these repertorios not only mobilized practical tools, but also a worldview that include a deep sense, I think, of local consciousness or awareness of space and time and the sense of development of history, but also of the place of the local, and these allow the construction of local identities. So if you ask, for example, why a parish church priest of a remote town in South America is calculating calendars, why is he trying to correct the Jews? Why is he interpreting comets as signs of war between Spain and the Ottomans? Why mathematics that are in the hands of the criollos, for example, gave rise to exchange with European, became these in the hands of Sanchez? And I think that the connection between mathematical disciplines and the shaping of these local identities is not limited or is not enlarged to an extension of European early modern trends, as it has been argued. I think on the contrary, that as in the case of Sanchez and others, they put astronomy, cosmography, and in some cases calendrics as messages, and the case of Sanchez is clear, sent by God to the New World, to all Christians, and especially to the King of Spain. So I think that, for example, in the case of Sanchez, the universal scope of this Christian identity, which encompasses his indigenous roots with providential views of evangelization of the world, but also with abstract universal mathematics, explains why, for example, the Tratado interprets the observation of comets as signs of wars or as signs of the triumph of Christianity over Muslims, even if the warships of the Ottomans were thousands of miles away from the hot and humid banks of the Magdalena River. So, well, thanks very much for your attention. I know there are many details that I left outside my presentation, but we can talk about them in case you are interested in some details. Last but not least, we have the presentation of Dr. Lawrence Rita. I'm very honored to have him here today. Edinburgh has had some important prizes in our seminar. In 2007 and 9, we had John Henry. He's a former director of the Science Studies Unit, but also in 2010, we had the presence of Ivan Crozier, who is a former member of the Science Studies Unit. So we have today Dr. Lawrence Rita, who began his studies in the United States in Penn State and Virginia Tech, and has interdisciplinary training in the humanities and the natural and social sciences. He volunteered as a secondary school biology teacher with the US Peace Corps in Malawi in the late 1990s. In 2005, he completed his PhD at the Center of African Studies in Edinburgh with a study of the scientific exploration of Africa in the mid-19th century. He's a senior lecturer in science and technology studies, and he's also head of the subject. Lawrence is a historian of science with a global focus. Within this large frame, he has a specific expertise in the histories of the natural science and the history of environmental thought. He conducts research on scientific expeditions, particularly the exploration of Africa and Scottish explorers, and the history of museum collections, and in the history of scientific knowledge in relation to colonial empires. He's normally teaching science, nature, and environment, science and empire, and he's now developing a new course on the history of environmentalism. So Lawrence, thanks very much for accepting this invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sergio. It's a wonderful introduction, and it's I'd completely forgotten, of course, that I was preceded by my wonderful colleagues, John Henry and Ivan Crozier, at your seminar. So that's wonderful to be along at the same time as them, be in the same seminar as them. It's great. I will share my screen now. Once I do that, yep, share screen. Let me just click the right button. Right, we're on screen 2. I think that's coming up for you now. Share. Okay.
Yep, visible.
Got it. Okay. And now that I'm on that, I'll just go to full screen. I think you have a full screen now. So that's great. Thanks very much. As Sergio said, I've had a particular interest in history museum collections lately, and particularly as they pertain to histories of understanding kind of the global environment. What I want to talk to you about today is, I've titled it Jameson's Museum, Building a Global Collection of Robert Jameson at the Edinburgh College Museum. And I'll be talking specifically about an early museum contained within the University of Edinburgh. I'll give you a timeline and explain that as we go on. This will focus on the first half of the 19th century, which is quite a fascinating time in the history of the University of Edinburgh and Edinburgh in general. Significant historians such as Steve Shapin, Jim Secord have written about Edinburgh in this time period and what was happening in the scientific community. My colleague Bill Jenkins has also written about this somewhat, especially concerning issues that Charles Darwin studied for a period of time at Edinburgh during the first half of the 19th century, as well as a number of other figures who would become significant later on. So along with a number of other historians, we continue to be interested in what was happening in Edinburgh in the first half of the 19th century and what the environment was for learning. What we've come to realize is that there is a museum that no longer exists. That was the Museum of Robert Jameson, and it was the Edinburgh College Museum. And it later, and I'll give you a timeline soon, but this museum eventually, by the mid-19th century, in 1854, in fact, was subsumed and given over to the government to become a national museum. And now actually, in that institution story has become the National Museum of Scotland. So Jameson's Museum, which was a significant place, is now somewhat lost to history. I'll talk more about that in a moment. So, and I am working with my colleague Bill Jenkins on this. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is quite a preliminary account or a preliminary story about some research that we hope to do in further depth. So I will attempt to answer any questions you have, but at the end, but I may have to say we don't know yet if I can't have an answer, but we are trying. The other thing, of course, that is interesting to connect this museum to is the very rich publishing culture in Edinburgh in the first half of the 19th century, with a large number of scientific journals and quite active debates happening in all of them. And these are of course read much more widely than in Edinburgh. So again, we have a significant publishing culture there, and a kind of contacts and networks that occurred through that print medium. Let me go with the timeline now, and I'll talk more about what we want to do. First, a little background here. University of Edinburgh was founded in 1583 as a college for the town. It is not the oldest university in Scotland, but it's among the 4 ancient ones. We have from scattered accounts knowledge that there were collections of natural history at the university in the 1600s. I've given a few names there of some collectors who then donated their objects to the university. The Balfour brothers, James and Andrew, both made significant collections and ended up donating them to the university. Robert Sibbald was another who made quite an extensive collection and seemed to have really thought that he wanted to have a collection organized for teaching natural history at the university. And we know, for instance, that around 1700 or so, there are quite a few travelers' reports, individuals like William Defoe, other people commenting that they visited the museum at the University of Edinburgh, and it was really one of the best collections they had seen. It was full of interesting objects, and it was in interesting rooms. But these early museums, if we can call them, or collections, or Wunderkammer, or cabinets of curiosity, whatever we want to call them, they have now kind of ceased to exist. For what it's worth, by 1767, from what we know, there was the first professor of natural history declared at the university was given a chair, and this was Robert Ramsay. This person, the chair, was also established to also be the keeper of the museum. Although in both these accounts, we don't know much, but we do know that Robert Ramsay may not have done his job very well. I don't think he's ever lectured, although I think there's some dispute about that. And whether or not he had responsibility for the museum, by 1779, Reverend Dr. John Walker, who was the next chair of natural history and keeper of the university's Museum of Natural History, reported that what he found was in an extremely poor and rundown state. Walker is a different story, and there is some, Charles Withers, significant historian of science, has written articles on John Walker's time and what John Walker did with his collection. It also was a significant collection used for teaching and also open to various travelers and other researchers, I guess we would call them today, who wanted to view it, and occasionally open to the public. However, on his death, many of the specimens John Walker considered his personal property. And when John Walker passed away, many of these things were taken by the trustees of his estate and removed from university premises. This was, of course, much to the shock of the next chair of natural history, Robert Jameson, who I want to talk to. So that background is to let you know that the University of Edinburgh had a long tradition of a collection of natural history to use for teaching, but also to be open to members of the public in certain circumstances. However, by the time when Jameson took his chair in 1804, there was almost nothing for him to work with. The rooms of the university were also in a rather dilapidated state. However, new buildings were being built. So what we want to really work on then is, what we do know is that over the next 50 years, Jameson amassed quite a large and significant natural history collection. In 1820, the museum got access to its new larger rooms, and I'll just back up. That's the rooms we see on the left here in this engraving from 1820. So those are the rooms that was given over to the Natural History Museum. quite a grand space, really. And we do know that this is still, you can still visit this space, although now one of the university's art galleries. I'll go forward ahead. And again, like I said earlier, in 1854, the museum, Jameson had died, a new chair of natural history was inaugurated, and he also became keeper of the museum, but the museum itself became government property and moved on to have a separate history, which I won't talk about here. Okay, so as I said, so let me talk a little bit more about Jameson in a minute. Right. Just a note, as I said earlier, this is a quote from Jameson on what he said, the condition of the museum he inherited. He said, on appointment to the chair of natural history in the year 1804, the museum was so inconsiderable that the whole of the articles were contained in a few cases. The specimens were birds, serpents, minerals, and dresses and weapons of savage nations. The birds were in so decayed a state that I was forced very soon to throw them out, and thus the original collection was reduced to a few glasses of serpents, a small collection of minerals, and the arms and dresses already mentioned. And again, this is a quoted by Withers in his article on John Walker, who was keeper of the previous museum. If I can go on then a bit to talk about Jameson. He was the professor of natural history and the keeper of the Edinburgh College Museum, joint appointment. And he did amass a natural history collection second only in the English-speaking world to the British Museum in London. The surviving records of Jameson's museum, including catalogs and acquisitions books, and an unexplored but significant proportion of his collection are under the stewardship today of National Museum Scotland. The first objective of the research we really want to do here is to reconstruct this collection and chart its development over time, establishing the arrangement and provenance of the objects and identifying those that are still in the collections of the museum. This is an important point. As I said, this is kind of a lost museum because much of it exists within the National Museum of Scotland, but some of the work to identify where it is and what still exists has yet to be done, or maybe possibly cannot be done because the cataloging the chain of cataloging has been broken. What we also want to do, though, is really to use our study of this collection to map and explore the global network of collectors who sent specimens to Jameson. And these included many former students of his. And I'll just skip ahead because I'm not skipping ahead. This is an important point. When Jameson gave his lectures of natural history, he usually finished up in his last week or so each year with a series of lectures on the advantages of travel and how to preserve things and send them back to him. Thus, he enrolled a significant group of individuals, as we know, 100% really men at this point, who were likely to travel the world, or at least travel quite regionally in Europe, and be keen collectors. And by this way, he would have them sent back to him. I notice on the right here, there's just a little. Jameson also distributed a pamphlet with printed instructions. Many copies of these turn up from time to time in the museum and university archives. And this is one, directions for preserving animals in fluids of different kinds, particularly during voyages. Likewise, Jameson's, so this network, this kind of ready-made network of collectors was there before him every year in his natural history class. And he would have taught these students really almost over a period of 4 years off and on. So he developed a close relationship with them. Jameson also established important relationships with many public and private bodies, including the Admiralty and the East India Company, which sent him regular consignments of specimens. The Admiralty had agreed to Jameson's request to a share of all specimens brought back by their expeditions fitted out at public expense, and that they would come to the Edinburgh College Museum. And in this way, he ensured a continual flow of specimens to Edinburgh from all around the world. He also, for example, he used his influence with the First Lord of the Admiralty, Saunders Dundas, to negotiate this arrangement. Many Arctic expeditions in the first half of the 19th century, remember the famous kind of Northwest Passage expeditions, for example, sent a great deal of material to the museum. So this was really one of his most important networks for the exchange of both natural history specimens and knowledge about the natural world in the early 19th century. It really deserves to be better known, not only for the light it sheds on the natural history in the first half of the 19th century, but to enrich our understanding of the present collection in the museum. So we're doing two different things here. On the right, on the left here on the screen in front of you is also a letter that came with a pamphlet that Jameson would print. And this is quite interesting. I'll kind of paraphrase what's happening here. In this letter that's been printed now, the letter dates to 1807, and what it indicates is that the keeper of natural history of the museum, that is Jameson, had requested to the government that the East India Company be compelled to have specimens sent to him free of charge should any employees of the government or the East India Company be collecting things. And you can see there in the first paragraph where he says, communicate to the servants of government or to others in our foreign settlements dependencies as may be laid before me by the present professor of natural history, as may lead them to collect and transmit such objects as will be fit for purposes of the museum. And they are to continue in all future time the public property of the university under the Regius Professor. And the government agreed with this and sent it on. And what Jameson did in printing this letter was to tell people that if they are overseas in any British possession, that they should be able to use this to have their specimens sent free of charge directly back to Jameson. And we have found letters, for instance, in the India office collections at the British Library. We have found letters from officers in the Indian Army actually citing this document here to say, here's a collection of specimens. I want to send them back to my former professor. Please, can you send them free of charge back to Edinburgh? And citing this letter, and then we see the approval coming through from the local government. So it's quite significant that this happens. A couple more things about Jameson's context in Edinburgh. He was really deeply enmeshed in Edinburgh's vibrant natural history and scientific cultures. His presidency, he was president of the Vanerian Natural History Society and edited both the Transactions and also edited the Edinburgh New Philosophical Journal. And this gave him a lot of influence. This patronage, the relations of patronage and friendship connected him with almost all the key figures of the period. He does appear everywhere, and many people who studied Edinburgh will talk about Jameson as a professor from this time, whether good or bad. And of course, this patronage and his networks he set up, as I've been saying, gave him access to specimens for dissection or drawing. He wrote references for academic posts or editorial roles, opportunities to publish with the two periodicals he controlled. So there's a lot of back and forth, him seeking specimens, but also giving out what support he could give through his positions. By this time, he doesn't really appear to have traveled very much himself at all and did very little collecting as far as we know. But he built this influence, he used his influence to build up this network of collectors. And the empire, of course, provided boundless opportunities for scientific exploration and collecting in this period, as scholars like Richard Drayton have pointed out. Although I will say that I believe the early 19th century, particularly the first 3 decades, are a bit unknown in terms of, I think we have a lot of great scholarship on Enlightenment travelers, and certainly a lot of scholarship on exploration in the kind of from the second quarter on in the 19th century, but maybe this first quarter of the 19th century is a bit less looked at. And certainly, I think we need to look at it more. And this kind of collection, I think, gives us the opportunity to do so. It's also known that Jameson really never turned anything away. In fact, space always was a problem for him. He seemed to always have too many specimens as opposed to too few. I guess, especially after the first few decades of this energetic work. But however, he did maintain tight access over his specimens, and he was known really to be quite strict in who he let to see things and who he did not. However, if you were in Jameson's good books, I might say, he did give you access to his collections, and many people talked about how good that was. And he also lent specimens to favored collaborators, or in fact, paper proxies in terms of sketches. For instance, just as an example, I was trying to find examples of specimens that are still available that we know are from Jameson's time and remain in the collections of the museum today. Here's one, a picture actually interestingly taken while the museum was being refurbished, because there's some paint pots on the left. But here we see an Irish elk, which is a fossil specimen of a giant elk from the Pleistocene. And we know, for instance, that Georges Cuvier was obtained sketches, very detailed sketches of this particular specimen from Jameson directly to assist really Cuvier in his comparative anatomical work. Another way that besides this network of collectors and getting things from all around the world, from his former students or his connections to various institutions and government or private institutions, he also was able, with the power of the university, to purchase large collections as he saw fit. And this is an example, and I'm sorry for the picture on the right being a bit poor quality. It's really the only one I could find at the moment of one of the specimens. But this, for instance, is just to have an example of one of the significant purchases he made when he knew that a collection became available and was able to deploy his networks to get it. In 1819, they purchased the natural history collection of Louise Dufresne, a taxidermist and zoologist who was at the base of the Muséum Royal d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris. The Dufresne collection was giant, with 1,600 bird specimens, 800 bird eggs, shells, insects, etc. I'm going to back up for a minute, because if you'll see this picture of this bird on the right, the Mauritius blue pigeon, I think it's now thought to be extinct. You can see from the caption here from the article I took it from by a former curator of the museum, and only a few other specimens are known. So it's really quite rare and still in the museum's collection today. I need to get a better picture of that. But if I back up, if we look at the pictures here of the museum in about 1820, so a year or so after they purchased the Dufresne collection and get access to it, I'm noting here in the side, I've never thought about it until today, actually, that these are all bird specimens here in this rack, and possibly here on the right. They're clearly birds being set on pedestals. So I don't think it's any surprise, the pride of purchasing Dufresne collection, and then that image having the birds in them, I think is interesting. Lots of insects as well. And Dufresne, of course, to show how the kind of Jameson's collecting networks were in fact kind of almost, they could extend through direct links or indirect links. So by purchasing Dufresne's collection, indeed, he was getting access. Dufresne was earlier in his career a naturalist on La Pérouse's famous expedition in the late 1780s to the Caribbean, South America, and the South Pacific. Many of these specimens Dufresne collected came via his time on La Pérouse's expedition. So we're kind of have then a secondary connection to La Pérouse, the famous La Pérouse, as an explorer. So that's happening as well. And then many other objects were purchased in that way. And of course, people also donated to him. I'm getting close to the end here. So I'll just give you an example of the kind of scale and scope of this. In the museum, there have been attempts in the past. These are documents from the 1950s of attempts by naturalists to make some sense of what may have come in the 1830s and 40s, that is during Jameson's time, to get a sense of what they have. And if you can look down on the right here, just leading to this list, we can get the scope of the global reach of this collection. There's a small collection from this. This is a list of mollusks, so shells, gastropods. We have shells from India, British shells, Tierra del Fuego. Curiously, shells from Lord Byron's expedition, and I really don't know anything about that yet, and I'm desperate to find out. These are Wabash and Fox River. That's actually Ohio in the United States. India, the Straits of Magellan, again, from down by Cape Horn, Moreton Bay in New South Wales, Australia, Africa, Northwest provinces, East India, you name it. We can go through this list. Port Natal, Bahia, the Andes, Jamaica. So, and there's some other handwritten lists here that give us similar kinds of information about the huge scope. And that's just looking at mollusks. So I'll just have a few clues. I'll go back to the beginning slide, because I think that's a nice one, a picture of Jameson and a picture of the museum, and just make some concluding points. Like I said, this is a lost museum, but I think it's important that we try to reconstruct it, because it is indeed, with the theme of this panel today, you know, the kind of way that students at Edinburgh, and indeed the larger intellectual community of Edinburgh, learned about the rest of the world and the natural history of the large world through an ever-expanding British Empire, and at a remove, the expanding empires of all European powers, and indeed North America and Australia as well, via his connections, is kind of displayed here in this space for students to be looking at. They really had access to the entire world. And we have to think more about how they felt about that, and that we can use things like their maybe even diaries of students and correspondence with the collectors and their own items of their own manuscript archives, then connect all this writing that must be almost as dispersed as where these specimens came from, to then reconstruct more things about what we can know about these objects and connect them to all this manuscript information, because that's been broken and we need to reconnect that. Secondly, and it would be a deep concern to me in particular, and kind of finishing up here, is that one thing that's lost often in a museum connection are the stories of how the objects are acquired in the first place. So that's one of the things I want to do here, is by going into this collection and establishing the network of collectors and then researching the collectors, we will then better know who the source communities are, and then uncover those hidden histories and the kind of hidden knowledge that comes from where the specimens came from. What locals in the various places where these items are sourced from, what were their stories? What information did they give over? What kind of assistance did they lend? How much does their thinking about the natural world influence the way these specimens are described and talked about? And I think there's a very interesting thing here with what Sergio was just showing us with these documents, with overlaying images that display cultural encounter happening in real time just in front of us. And I think I'd really be looking to do the same thing here with this collection, to get these hidden histories out so we can better know how understand the cultural encounter that's happening here, and then understand better how people viewed it here in Edinburgh. And on that point, I will conclude, and I'll really be happy to take any questions from all of you about that and my fellow contributors. Thanks very much.
Well,
and
Lawrence, thanks.
Stop sharing my screen. Yep, there we go.
Perfect.
Great.
Well, thanks very much for the presentation and the images. I have a lot of questions for both. So I remind everyone attending that if you're on Facebook, you can post a comment and our communication officer is going to pass a question here. Or if you are here in Zoom, you can write on the box, or you can raise your hand if you want to speak, and we'll give you audio for you to make your question. But I want to ask a question to start to you both, because I see some structural similarity in the sense that both Jameson and Caldece recognize that part of the project requires further collaboration, and they both try to establish like networks of information and connection, and they both rely not only on kind of like their position in society to do that. In the case of Jameson, this fantastic agreement with the Admiralty that is like using the network of the kind of like British Empire to get. And Caldece used newspaper, the magazine advertising, on which he had a lot of influence to ask for information. So I want to ask you both, in the case of what were the instructions that were asked? So in the case, for example, of Caldece, there's this advertisement. What is it specifically asked? Because in that case, you're asking for kind of like meteorological, geographical, geological information. So did he provide any clues on exactly what he wanted, or the methods or techniques to get that? Or in the case of Jameson, you showed this Lawrence's description of how to preserve animals. But apart from that description of how to preserve animals, where can we find any other information about, for example, the context in which the specimen was found? Or for example, okay, that's my first question. And also you can mention, if you can mention that I see a significant change in the emphasis on birds and animals, but in Jameson's initial remark, there were also dress, clothing, and weapons. So is that lost in his period when he did this connection with the Admiralty? Was more to this more limited sense of natural history, or clothing and weapons were still circulating in the network. So, well, who wants to answer first?
Sebastián, do you want to, shall I go?
Yes, please.
Because I think the first part I might, thank you very much, Sergio, that those are great questions. The first part of my answer is, I think I have looked through in a preliminary way the accessions registers. Fortunately, we have the register of objects coming in, at least from about 1820 or 1812 into Jameson's museum, and it describes where things come from. And we do see objects that we would think more as ethnographic material now. However, it's often the case, and I don't have a good answer of why this is, that's often given less detail. You have a detailed list of animals and plants and then some canoes, right? And you're wondering what's happening there. But I think that's actually a matter for more research. I think we'll find out more, but it does continue. And I do think as the period goes on, as we get closer to 1850, the kind of ethnography splits away from the natural history to some degree. But I think earlier on, it's kind of everything. I know, and just another, you were saying like more instructions he gave. You know, I know there was, I read a bit of correspondence to him with Stanley Raffles, who was significant for the founding of Singapore. And he's in direct communication with him and saying, you know, and basically saying, we have very little from the East. You know, can you please send us, you know, anything you have, particularly articles of dress. He kind of lists through things. And what preliminary correspondence I've already seen, you know, preliminary research has shown some correspondence with where we have it, where it's been saved with students, where he does say, you know, I have enough of this. Can you send some of that? Oh, if you're in that part of the world, I could really use this to kind of make my collection more complete. So he's being quite prescriptive at times with people that he feels he can be, right? In other cases, I think he's just going to take what he gets. And certainly, but I should say that in museum practice, both today and in this time, duplicates can be an asset because you can use duplicates to trade. So you can trade with other museums your duplicates. So that's another thing that was going on, and we'll have to look at that. Actually, I don't have any information except that I know it was a practice. Is that I think that helps for the moment.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks very much. Sebastián.
Yes, in the case of Caldece, as far as I know, he did indeed wrote an indication of how to make the measurements, and even he created a way to make small meteorological instruments to the subscribers of the seminar. In one of the numbers of 1808, he made this description of how to make the measurements, how to make the instruments, and then in 1811 he wrote a paper specifically designed to thank the subscribers who sent him the observations gathered from Cali, from Popayán, from Cartagena, and then he interestingly connected these observations to a project, to a national, I think even Republican project. This is a point I didn't mention in my presentation, but this is particularly interesting because in the time between 1808 and 1811, we have the independence revolution of 1810, and Caldece used the revolution as an instrument to create a kind of patriotic scientific project in which these kind of observations were included. I seize the opportunity to ask Professor Lawrence. I see that you mentioned in your presentation that Jameson used the network created with the East Indian Company. I don't know if there is any connections also with the West Indian Company. Of course, it would be harder to trace, but was there any possible connection? Because in the case of the East Indian Company, it is relatively easy to make the network acting there, but in the other case, it seems a little bit harder for me.
Right. Thanks very much, Sebastian. I actually agree with you. I think one of the, again, my answer will be, I'm going to find out. But one thing we want to do is really do a careful, if you like, quantitative analysis of the accessions and a geographical kind of analysis of it, so that we really can kind of map this out. I know, there's definitely a lot of material from the West Indies and from South America, and kind of I know less at the moment about the routes they come through, and I want to learn more about that and see what those kind of connections look like. I mean, Britain's presence in South America is much more of an informal empire, except for some informal kind of imperial space, or I don't know if we can even call it that. But it's informal as opposed to direct, except for a few territories, of course. So it'd be interesting to see what's happening there. And indeed in British Honduras or British Guiana, it'd be interesting to know what the situation and what kind of the collection looks like from there. So that's not a great answer to the question, but I might have one, if I may. Sergio, can I ask Sebastián, one right back?
Yeah, of course, you can shoot back.
I was just wondering, Caldece seems like the kind of person who may have corresponded with Alexander von Humboldt. So I was wondering if there's any connection there between Humboldt and Caldece, and particularly because you mentioned phytogeography and things, and you can see where I'm going. It's obvious the time period, and of course Humboldt being so interested in Bolivar and Republican movements in South America. So
yes, indeed, there was a connection. They lived together for 3 months. Together. In fact, Caldece slept in the same bedroom with Bonpland in the expedition when they were from Ibarra to Quito in the Ecuador. Caldece shared his invention of the method, as well as his comments about the phytogeography, with Humboldt, and he asked Humboldt to include him in the expedition. In the rest of the expedition, Humboldt decided not to include him, arguing that it was really expensive to include another person in the expedition. And Caldece developed a really bitter sentiment against Humboldt. But eventually, when Caldece was appointed a member of the botanical expedition, he used this connection with Humboldt to publish some of Humboldt's works in the Semanario. Translated versions of the geography of the plants, for instance, were published in the Semanario. And yes, indeed, there was a mutual influence that has been studied by several historians of science in Colombia.
Well, thanks very much for that. Are you going to say something back, Lawrence?
I was going to ask you a question, but I know maybe your chair has a list of questions as well. But
no, yeah. Come, I have a question for you. So
I'll ask you about, you mentioned this cosmographical turn in the Repertorios in 1548. And I was just wondering, and you're saying you've just noticed this. I was wondering if you thought there was a significance to the date being, we have discovery of new worlds and new connections to India, from the 1490s. So we're not that long after that. And is this maybe a representation or a consequence of this kind of new world expanding the scope of people thinking of what the size of globe they're actually dealing with is, and therefore maybe the Repertorios need to become more, in a sense, geographical and like world books, as you were saying? Just wondering if you.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that definitely, like, cosmography became basically an imperial policy, and the Spanish Empire was politically interested in promoting mathematical education in the early 16th century, and so that was it became popular, and I think there's an initial motivation to, in the case of Chavez, to correct previous almanacs and calendars. What is significant to me as well, and is connected to your question, is that he used, and it became popular, well accepted, these repertories that were used for agriculture. You know, it was for very, very practical purposes. He used that space to popularize a worldview, a complicated kind of like technical worldview, including mathematical resources, natural philosophical theories of the elements, of medicine, of the world, and also kind of like geographical novelties about measures of, you know, latitudes and longitudes that Spaniards were doing, not with clocks or timekeepers as British did later on, but with eclipses to calculate latitudes and longitudes. So this became the medium to do that, and it's definitely connected to a growing kind of like political interest in cosmography. What I find fascinating is how the place to do this, I mean, one of the places to do this, there were many, but rather than big treatises that you can still find as well, but it made the way to these little pieces that we still have in our culture, right? We still have these almanacs that are still printed with eclipses and astronomical forecasts and stuff. So it went to these little pieces of, you know, the society that were popular and printed. I was telling the other day that I'm doing an inventory of repertorios printed in 16th century to characterize them. And I have been able to identify at least 37 different patterns of cosmographical repertorios, like with little changes. Some emphasize more geography, some include navigational information that others lack. For example, information on the needle, on the compass, and some other includes more geographical information, some other more medical information. So I think there is a big flow of this political interest, like imperial interest in cosmography, that cosmographers can like put into these little pieces of paper, and that become absolutely widespread in the New World. Like repertories are massively traded, sold, smuggled into the New World. Some of them were censored because they contain novel ideas on comets, so they were censored. And that meant in the 16th century that your book was way more popular because people are more interested in reading censored books. So there is a massive spread of that. And this is a network of information highly unexplored. Everyone is focusing more on the big treatises, Aristotelian treatises read at universities, or the work of big cosmographer. But what is, you know, where are these repertorios going in kind of like common people in the New World? I have a question from audience translation, and is a question for Lawrence. And if these animals these animal studies that were collected there, were they studied in kind of like isolation but not connected to their ecosystems? Was there any study attempting to connect these animals with their ecosystem, or the studies were more like morphological, anatomical studies than ecological studies?
Well, that's a very good question, and I'll have to think about. I mean, it's almost something I'm going to put into my research questions. How does that look? I think the kind of the life habits of the animal will have been asked for, and I've seen the records of that. You know, saying how does it live? What kind of life does it live? You know, do you know what it eats? Kind of thing. Whether that's becoming a true ecology on the part of Jameson, I'm not sure, but of course, other people studied this collection as well. And like I said, people like Charles Darwin studied it as a student and then went on to do what he did, just as one famous example. So we know he was thinking about animals in a wider setting and interacting with each other also. So it's almost like we have to kind of do the groundwork to establish this collection more clearly, and then go on to see who went on to do what kind of work from it. However, I will add that, you know, very often the questions that the typical instructions for this will also be about collecting any information from locals about the animal or plant or things, particularly its local name, which sometimes can then clear up confusion between whether it's the same animal or a different animal that's been collected previously, and also any uses they have for it. And this could be a very imperial way of looking at it. More so, I think, with plants and minerals, like, is there a use Is it a medicine? Can it be used to cure some type of fever or something? And that would be really, really important information. And especially with the plant material, the materia medica, that would be automatically collected, hopefully included with it. And part of our project is to try to, again, to find this kind of information and reconnect it back to what objects still exist. Thanks for that.
In that sense, there's an interesting question about the use of the collection. You have mentioned that the collection was mostly used for teaching, and it's obviously related to the university and teaching practices. And but is there also any other use of the collection? I mean, the collection, was it intended for anything else than teaching? Had it any intention to kind of like reflect? I'm thinking about other colonial example. I'm thinking about, for example, the Belgium occupation of Congo. It's very late after that, but there was an attempt to collect objects to bring to Brussels and to show to locals, and to also mobilize political interest, investments, and to show like, look how it looks there. You can put money into this, company of Belgium, and go there and get some piece of it. So was there any other use apart from teaching?
Well, I mean, very good question. I there's two parts to that answer. I mean, in a purely kind of natural history sense, many natural historians asked for access and were granted it, and came to look at particular specimens. Or, as I said, sometimes they were lent, or sketches of things were lent, like the example of the Irish elk being sent to Cuvier, who had particular anatomical questions. He knew the Irish elk could help, and then got access to it. What is problematic with Jameson is that he was slightly old-fashioned and a Venerian, and that's another story, a long story we could go into. But if he didn't like what you were doing, he was quite quick to not let you in as well. So he would keep people out of it. It was also left on. I will say also, it was also open to the public at times. Although, again, Jameson had a lot of concern about this, but there was quite a bit of pressure from the university and from the Edinburgh City Council to let members of the public in at certain points to view the collection and to see it. And he was always very worried about this, particularly when it was what he called the lower classes, thinking he wouldn't behave properly in the museum. So the public was allowed in to kind of see the wonders. What I don't know, and I think it's a fascinating question you ask, is one of the things we want to establish is kind of because this collection is somewhat lost, and there's been very little studies of it in the way we want to do, very little written about it actually, is what is its position kind of informally within, if you like, the British Empire. I mean, there have been studies of the East India Company museums, the London Missionary Society museums, and the British Library that talk about this, but Edinburgh kind of sits there. We seem to know it was more significant than maybe we remember it for, and maybe we need to do some work to figure that out. But if the Admiralty was actually quite happy to send lots of things back to it, it seems like maybe it was more important than we think as a place to display, this is, of course, after Britain loses the new North American colonies to a large extent. And so it's kind of it's rebuilding its empire, as it were, into what we sometimes call the Second British Empire by the middle of the 19th century. So it's interesting to think about that. And those are just questions I really want to answer. Yeah, thanks.
Well, thanks very much for that. Carlos has a question.
Yes. Can you hear me well?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, thank you. Thank you everyone for your talks, all of them very interesting. I would like to make a comment on the presentation made by our guest professor, perhaps with the intention of motivating a discussion that integrates maybe all your talks. And I would like to make my comment based especially on an issue related to what Sergio presented. If I've understood correctly, almanacs and repertorios do not have an innocent epistemic pretension. They are not only epistemic devices for the divulgation of knowledge, but they instantiate, for example, forms of epistemic colonialism. Through these repertorios, for example, an identity is configured a way of understanding the space of time, a way of living in acting with the world, and even a form of iconic or pictographic thinking, no? Which has to do fundamentally with the drawings that Sergio showed us in the presentation about the movements of celestial bodies. I mean, in general terms, with the repertorios and even with the way of collecting samples to be exhibited in museums, the aim is to give positioning to the knowledge agents. The agents are configured as agents situated and conditioned to the forms of validation of production of knowledge. So my question is, can this pretension be understood as epistemic colonialism that marginalized other forms of knowledge, or could we rather understand it as a kind of epistemic paternalism that does not necessarily have to be detrimental, but rather contributes to the epistemic resource of the colonized agents? This is my question.
Carlos, thanks very much. Thanks very much for your question. Lawrence, what are your thoughts on this?
Gosh.
It's a difficult question, right?
It is difficult. I was thinking you were going to go first. I thought he was asking you more than me. Yeah. Gosh, I you know, if I understand correctly, we're talking about agency here. Is that right, Carlos? And who? I was, yeah. I think it's important. I don't know. I was actually thinking about this today as I teach a class on science and empire, and this is slightly unrelated, but we were talking about the British in India today in class, and I was reminded of a quote from Kapil Raj in an important paper he wrote on circulation of knowledge, and he was pointing out that even though if we're talking about, you know, I think the quote is something like, you know, being colonized is not antithetical to having some agency, right? So I think I think if we attend really carefully to our records and read them in different ways and specimens, and I'm very kind of interested in specimens these days and seeing and objects and seeing what we can deduce from them, then we can see both where knowledge is trying to be acquired sometime by force, but also where the agency of where it's coming from is present. I think we can do both, if that makes sense. I don't think I'm making a lot of sense on this question, but maybe I'll pass off to Sergio. Yeah.
No, I think it makes sense. And when Carlos was asking, I was thinking about there's a fantastic remark by Jorge Cañizares, which I think it really captures an idea that it's very powerful in the case of the Spanish Empire. And he claims that the Spanish Empire was basically something built from bottom to the top.
Right.
So there's this view that there's a center of power and there's a power oppressing everyone. But a very important aspect of this is that, for example, a empire like Spanish Empire or a case like the British Empire, although colonization forms are quite different, but in the case of the Spanish Empire, is an empire across the Atlantic in the 16th century, where communication is really poor, where, you know, sending an army is fairly impossible, it's fairly difficult, and where, for example, explorers and even invaders had to rely on local provisions, on local, you know, relationships for providing food. So I think an important aspect of this remark by Cañizares is that to understand the Spanish Empire, we need also to understand how it was built by the people who obviously were invaded, conquered, and was terrible, especially in the first 50, 60, 70 years of this period of settlement. But also it's very important, for example, in the case of knowledge, how knowledge became a way to make sense of a wider community. So in this sense, for example, is that I try to capture this idea that I think Lawrence was making reference to when he was saying that being conquered doesn't necessarily suppress all agency. And I think this is what points the fact that many of these indigenous, for example, the writers of the Codex Mexicanos, they were trying to make sense of their reality, of their history in a new reality, right? So we can make judgments about that. We can judge that, but I think that the work of the historian is a bit like to point what happened and how that happened and how worldview clashed there. And obviously for explaining that, we have to study relations of power, and we have to understand how power flew from one side to the other. But as the Spanish Empire settled, and there's an important aspect that is mentioned, is that what in legal documents look a lot like a commandment from the king is in fact just a formalization of an individual requirement. So in strong sense, the Spanish Empire was in a large sense self-ruled by locals. So what looks now from archival work like I, the king, Joel Ray, command to do this, was in fact an answer that verbatim translates what was requested, because the king cannot know what is happening in all the provinces. So there was kind of like networks of information that basically transmitted petitions from the very, very bottom of the society to networks of knowledge. So when we check the archives, and if we quickly check the archives, we find the orders. But when we check the requerimientos, what people are asking for, we find that there's also, in most cases, there's a match between what the king commands and the people ask. It's not the only kind of like power relationship, but this is a clue to indicate that we need to see kind of that there's a complex relationship here that I think cannot be easily put in terms of oppressor and oppressed in terms of knowledge, and that very complex relationship. I think it's super clear in the case of Sanchez, who sees himself as coming from indigenous, but also as Spaniards, and then he reads his background as part of the history of redemption, which is of course a form of colonialism, clearly, but at the same time is a way to make sense of a reality. I don't know if Sebastian wants to remark something about that, because Carlos mentioned that is a question for kind of like we want to talk about that.
Yes, I will only include a brief comment in which I would like to remark that this kind of approach, bottom up, made possible the development of several formal procedures in the Spanish kingdom, in the Spanish rule of the New World. For instance, when the king formulated a cédula real, a royal decree to rule the New World, he usually began saying something like, "As I was informed, como me han dicho, como he sido informado." Then this formula ended with a decree. As I've been informed, I decree this and that. And this kind of information was produced precisely by local agents that, being in situ, had the information available to create these new no laws, but these intended to be laws in the end.
Thank you for your answers. Very interesting.
Well, thanks very much. Okay, so it's our time now. So thanks very much for attending. Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, Sebastián, for accepting this invitation. I think we still have all the three of us. These are projects we are working on. So I hope we can meet in the future and exchange some developments on our research. So thanks very much for accepting the invitation. I want to thank everyone the Laura Communication Officer, to the people of IT support, Andrea, and everyone who attended this morning or this afternoon, depending on when you're watching us. So thanks very much. Good afternoon and see you later.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Really interesting. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.